where can she be? Where is my good one, yeah? The Thaumaturge took her from me. That's it. Chapter 43. Back into it with Cress, baby. And we're almost done. We're on book 4, so this is nearly wrapped up with this one. Then we move on to Fairness. Chapter 43. Cress stood to the side of the lab table, clutching a port screen as Dr. Erland held a strange tool beside Thorn's face, sending a thin beam of light into his pupils. The doctor grunted and bobbed his head in comprehension. Mm-hmm, he drawled, changing the tool settings so that a green light clicked on near the bottom. Mm-hmm, he said again, switching to the other eye. Cress leaned closer, but she couldn't see anything that would warrant such thoughtful humming. The tool in the doctor's hand made a few clicking sounds, and he took the port screen out of Cress's hand. He nodded at it before handing it back to her. She looked down at the screen, where the strange tool was transferring a jumble of incomprehensible diagnoses. Mm-hmm. Would you please stop and tell me what's wrong with me? Said Thorn. Patience, said the doctor. The optic system is delicate, and an incorrect diagnosis could be catastrophic. Thorn crossed his arms. The doctor changed the setting on his tool again, and completed another scan of Thorn's eyes. Indeed, he said. Severe optic nerve damage, likely as a result of traumatic head injury. My hypothesis is that when you hit your head during the fall, internal bleeding in your skull caused a sudden pressure buildup against the optic nerve, and Thorn waved, bumping the doctor's tool away from him. Can you fix them? Dr. Erland huffed and set the tool down on the counter that ran the length of the Rampion's medbay. Of course I can, he said, sounding insulted. The first step will be to collect some bone marrow from the iliac crest portion of your pelvic bone. From that, I can harvest your hematopoietic stem cells, which we can use to create a solution that can be externally applied to your optic system. Over time, the stem cells will replace your damaged retinal ganglion cells and provide cellular bridges among the disconnected... Fine, I get it, said Thorn, covering his ears. Please, never say that word again. Dr. Erland raised an eyebrow. Cellular, hematopoietic, ganglion... That last one, Thorn grimaced. Ugh. The doctor scowled. Are you squeamish, Mr. Thorn? Eye stuff weirds me out, as does any surgery regarding the pelvic bone. You can knock me out for that part, right? He lay back on the exam table. Do it fast. A localized numbing agent will suffice, said Dr. Erland. I even happen to have something that should work in my kit. However, while we can harvest the bone marrow today, I don't have the instruments necessary to separate the stem cells or create the injection solution. Thorn slowly sat up again. So, you can't fix me? Not without the proper lab. Thorn scratched his jaw. Alright, what if we skip the whole stem cells injection solution thing and just swapped out my eyeballs for some cyborg prosthetics instead? I've been thinking about how handy X-ray vision could be, and I have to admit, the idea has kind of grown on me. You're right, said Dr. Erland, eyeing Thorn over the frames of his glasses. That would be much simpler. Really? No. Thorn's mouth twisted into a frown. At least now we know what's wrong, said Cress, and that it can be fixed. We'll figure something out. The doctor glanced at her, then turned away and set about organizing the medbay cabinets with the equipment they'd taken from his hotel. He seemed to be making an attempt to hide any emotion aside from professional curiosity, but Cress got the impression that he didn't care much for Thorn. His feelings toward her, on the other hand, were a mystery. She didn't think he'd met her eye once since they'd left the hotel, and she suspected he was ashamed about the whole purchasing lunar shells for their blood thing, which he had every reason to be ashamed of. Although they were on the same side now, she hadn't yet forgiven him for how he'd treated her and countless others, like cattle at an auction. Not that she'd ever seen a cattle auction. If she were honest with herself, she had uncertain opinions about most of the crew of the Rampion. After seeing Wolf snap in the hotel, Cress had done her best to steer clear of him when she could. His temper and the knowledge of what his kind were capable of made her hair prickle on her neck every time his vivid green eyes met hers. It didn't help that Wolf hadn't spoken a word since they'd left Africa. While they'd all discussed the danger of staying in orbit before Cress could reinstate her systems for keeping them unobserved, Wolf had crouched solitarily in a corner of the cockpit, staring empty-eyed at the pilot's seat. When Cinder had suggested that they go somewhere that was in reach of New Beijing while they figured out the next phase of their plan, Wolf had paced back and forth in the galley, cradling a can of tomatoes. When they had finally descended into the desolate wasteland of the Commonwealth's northern Siberian regions, Wolf had lain on his side in the lower bunk bed of one of the crew quarters, his face buried in a pillow. Cress had assumed it was his bed, until Thorne informed her it had been Scarlett's. Dude's heartbroken, man. I get it. I'm sorry. She pitied him, of course. Anyone could see that he was devastated at Scarlett's loss, but she feared him more. Wolf's presence was like a ticking bomb that could explode at any moment. Then there was Jason Clay, Sybil's one-time guard, who spent most of his time in smug silence. When he did talk, he tended to say something rude or prickly. Plus, while he may have joined their side now, Cress couldn't help but think of all the times he had brought Mistress Sybil to her satellite. How many years he'd known about her captivity and done nothing to help her. And then there was the escort droid, with her master this and master that, and would you like me to rub your feet and wash your feet and give you a nice foot rub, master? Captain! Cress bristled at the girlish squeal, followed by a blur of blue that fluttered into the medbay and slammed into Thorne, nearly knocking him off the lab table. He grunted. What? I love it, said the escort. I absolutely love it. It's the best present anyone has ever gotten me, and you're the best captain in the whole wide galaxy. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. The android took to smothering Thorne's face in kisses, ignoring his struggles to back away on the table. Cress pressed her fingers into the port screen until her arms began to shake. Aiko, let him breathe, said Cinder, appearing in the doorway. Right, sorry! The android grabbed Thorne's cheeks and planted one more adamant kiss on his mouth before pulling away. Cress's jaw began to ache from grinding her teeth. Aiko? Said Thorne. In the flesh! How do I look? She struck a pose for Thorne, but then immediately started to laugh. Oops! Well, you'll just have to take my word for it that I am gorgeous! Plus, I checked the manufacturer's catalog and I can upgrade to 40 different eye colors! I kind of like the metallic gold ones, but we'll see. Trends are so fleeting, you know? Getting to relax, Thorne smiled. I'm glad you like her, but if you're here, who's running the ship? I just switched out the personality chips, said Cinder. Darla didn't seem to care one way or the other. Something about whatever would please my master. Ugh. I also undid some of her programming. Hopefully she won't be too concerned about law-breaking after this. Just how I like my ships, said Thorne. Darla, are you up there? Ready to serve, Captain Thorne, said a new voice in the speakers overhead, strangely robotic compared with Aiko's hyperactive tones. I am pleased to act as your new auto-control system, and will strive to ensure the safety and comfort of my crew. Thorne beamed. Oh, I'm going to like her. When you're done with your examination, said Cinder, listing her head toward the door, come out to the cargo bay. We have a lot we need to discuss. Break, and then back in. Actually, we're going to take this nice commercial break to get a little hydration station going on here. Da 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 da. This book is so fucking good. Within minutes, the crew of the Rampion had assembled in the cargo bay. Aiko sat cross-legged in the middle of the floor, mesmerized by the sight of her own bare toes. Dr. Erlond had wheeled out the small desk chair from the medbay to sit on. Cress didn't think his old age and short legs would have allowed him to get up on one of the storage crates unassisted. Wolf leaned against the door to the cockpit, shoulders hunched, hands tucked into his pockets, and dark circles beneath his eyes. Opposite him, Jason stood against the wall beside the corridor that led to the crew quarters and the galley, turned sideways as if he could only be bothered to give Cinder half his attention. Cress led Thorne to one of the large storage crates, hoping it wasn't obvious that she was putting as much distance between herself and Wolf as she could. Clearing her throat, Cinder came to stand between them, in front of the large net screen embedded into the cargo bay wall. The wedding is in 4 days, she started, and I hope, that we're all in agreement that we cannot allow Levana to become the Commonwealth's Empress. Her coronation would be a legally binding position that couldn't be easily undone, and giving her that sort of power, well, you know. She scuffed her boots against the metal floor. Our plan before had been to interrupt the royal wedding and attempt to publicly dethrone Levana while she was here, on Earth. But Dr. Erlond has convinced me that it won't make a difference. It might keep her from being Empress for now, but as long as the people of Luna still call her their queen, she will continue to harass Earth however she can. So, I believe the only way for us to truly rid ourselves of Levana is to go to Luna and persuade the people to rebel against her. And crown a new monarch. She seemed to hesitate. Her eyes flashed toward Jason before she continued. And I think, if we can pull it off, I know of a way to get us up there without being seen. Thorn tapped his cane against the plastic crate. All right, Miss Cryptic, what's the new plan then? Glancing around the room, Cinder tipped up her chin. It starts with kidnapping the groom. Thorn stopped tapping his cane and the room fell quiet. Pressing her lips, Cress dared to scan the faces of the rest of the crew, but everyone seemed perplexed. Aiko's hand shot into the air. Yes, Aiko? This is the best idea ever! Count me in! Some of the tension started to dissipate, and Cinder even chuckled. I hope you all feel that way, because I need your help for this to work. We need supplies still, and wedding invitations and costumes. She shook her head, clearing the dazed look that had entered her eyes. But right now, I think our biggest problem will be locating Kai once we're inside. I haven't been able to find out anything about a tracking ID for him. The Royal Guard seems to have done too good a job at keeping any stalkers or assassins at bay. Cress leaned forward. Why not use the 10 Caro number? They all swivered their attention toward her, and Cress immediately shrank back. What's that? Said Cinder. It's, Emperor Kato's tracking number? 0089175004? I did that wrong, hang on. 0089175004? There we go. The net profile shows up as a palace guard named Tan Caro, but he's just a foil. It's really the ID that the Royal Security Team uses to track His Majesty. I've been using it to confirm his location for ages. Really? How did you ever figure that out? Face burning, Cress opened her mouth, realized it was going to be a very long, tedious explanation, and closed it again. It doesn't matter, said Cinder, rubbing her temple. If you're sure it's him. I am. So, great. Number 008... Aiko, did you get that? Got it! Thanks, Cress. She exhaled. Cinder rubbed her hands together. So, here's what I had in mind. Cress, you're in charge of disabling the palace security system. Wolf, you'll cover her. Cress's head flew up, gaze clashing with Wolf's. She shriveled against Thorn's side. The last thing she wanted was to be paired with Wolf. Sure, Cinder and Thorn seemed to trust him, but how much could they really know about a man who had nearly strangled Cinder in that hotel, who had howled like a wild animal, who had been created for the purpose of killing humans in the most horrific, senseless way? But nobody seemed to notice her fear, or if they did, they ignored it. Meanwhile, Cinder continued, Aiko and I will track down Kai and get him to come back with us. We meet on one of the rooftops, and Jason picks us up and flies us out before they realize what's going on. At least that's the idea. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. It does leave one major problem, though. I won't be able to sneak in as a guest, or even a member of the staff. I'm too recognizable. So, how do I get into the palace without being noticed? I could go without you, suggested Aiko. Cinder shook her head. Kai doesn't know you. If we're going to get him to trust us, I think it has to be me. Jason scoffed, the first sound he'd made, but Cinder ignored him. Cress bit her lip as the others started making suggestions. She could disguise herself as a member of the media, scale the back walls, hide in an enormous bouquet of flowers. Already red with embarrassment, Cress forced her mouth open. What about... She trailed off as everyone turned to her. What? Said Cinder. What about... the escape tunnels? Escape tunnels? She pulled on her hair, wishing there was more of it to toy with, to twist and knot and take out her fluttering nerves on. But it was short now, short and light and freeing, and everyone was still staring at her. Goosebumps raced down her arms. The ones that run beneath the palace. When they built it after the war, they had the tunnels put in to connect with fallout shelters and safe houses, in case of another attack. Cinder glanced at the net screen. None of the blueprints I've seen have said anything about escape tunnels. They wouldn't be very safe if everyone knew about them. But how did you... Cinder paused. Never mind. Are you sure they're still there? Of course they are. I don't suppose you remember where any of them go. Of course I do. She wiped her clammy palms on her sides. Excellent. Cinder looked on the verge of relaxing. So before we get into the details, are there any question... How long before we're on Luna? Said Wolf, his voice gruff from misuse. Cress gulped. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like he could tear them all to pieces without a second thought. Then she realized there was a subtext to his question, one that everyone else had probably picked up on immediately. Scarlet. He really wanted to know how long before he could go after Scarlet. A couple of weeks, at least, said Cinder. Her voice had gone quiet, apologetic. Maybe as many as 3. Jaw tightening, Wolf turned his head away. Otherwise he remained motionless, a brooding shadow in the corner. Thorn raised a finger, and Cinder went rigid again. Yes? Doesn't New Beijing Palace have its own medical labs? Say, medical labs that might have magical blindness curing machines in them? Cinder narrowed her eyes. You're not coming. It's too risky, and you would just be in the way. Thorn grinned, unperturbed. Think about it, Cinder. When Cress takes out the security system, every guard in that palace is going to run to one of 2 places. To the security control center to see what's going on, or to wherever the precious Emperor is, to make sure he's safe and sound. Unless there was another, even more obvious disturbance happening somewhere else in the palace. He cupped his chin. A big disturbance, far, far away from you guys. Like, say, in the medical labs? Nodding her hands in her lap, Cress swiveled her attention between Thorn and Cinder, wondering what sort of disturbance he had in mind. For her part, Cinder looked torn. She kept opening her mouth before slamming it shut again. She did not seem happy to be contemplating Thorn's idea. I have a question too. No, I have a question too. Cress jumped and turned to peer over her shoulder at Jason. He looked supremely bored, one elbow propped against the wall and his hand buried in his hair, as if he were about to fall asleep standing up, but his blue eyes were sharp as he stared at Cinder. Let's say you pull this off. Not that I really think you will. Cinder folded her arms. You do understand that once Levana realizes what you've done, she's not going to sit around waiting to see what you do next, right? The ceasefire will be over. I do understand that, said Cinder, her tone heavy as she pulled her gaze away from Jason, meeting the others in turn. If we succeed, we'll be starting a war. War never changes. Except, when it does. Chapter 44. Hold up, before we get into this chapter, I'm going to get a little sippy of water. So, Thorn wants to go with Dr. Erlon to get his eyes fixed. Rightfully so. Aiko and Cinder have to somehow talk Prince Emperor Kai to going onto the roof so they can abduct him. Or I guess now it'll be through the tunnels. Cool. Cress is going to hack the security system, and Wolf's going to cover her. Cool. Jason's going to be in the ship doing a flyby. Cool. Yeah, I don't see how that can go wrong. I mean, it's not like they have a better plan, to be fair. Chapter 44. The morning of the wedding arrived. Cinder was a wreck of frazzled thoughts and skittish nerves, but at the center of it was a strange sense of calm. Before the sun set again, she would know the outcome of all their planning and preparations. Either they would succeed today, or they would all become prisoners of Queen Levana. Or they'd be dead. She tried not to think of that as she showered and dressed and ate a meager breakfast of stale crackers and almond butter. It was all her churning stomach could handle. The sun had just showed itself over the frosted Siberian tundra where they piled into the remaining pod ship. 7 people crammed into a space meant for 5, to embark on the 40-minute low-elevation flight to New Beijing. No one complained. The Rampion was far too large to hide. At least the pod ship would be able to blend in with the other pod ship in a city suddenly swarming with foreign spacecraft. The ride was torturous and mostly silent, punctuated only by Aiko's and Thorn's occasional chatter. It says Aiko and Thorn's occasional chatter. So I'm just imagining, and I'm just going to have a conversation so you can see what I'm imagining. So, like, everything's quiet, and then...
I was reading in a catalog that there's these sorts of dresses that I can get with this sort of differential cut as it goes down to the hem.
Well, I can't see what you're referring to, but I imagine that would be very good. I used to know this girl that I played poker with about 3 years before my imprisonment. She had something I imagine would be similar.
Yeah, it might be something like that. I'm imagining that this is what you're talking about. But no, and not only is it that I can get all these different dresses, but look at the different hair colors that I can get. And I know my hair is blue right now, but maybe I would go with gold instead, or ooh, maybe even something with rainbow streaks as it goes off to the side.
But that's got to be kind of hard to maintain, don't you think? At least I would imagine so.
Not really. At least I wouldn't think so, but then I can just get more products that will help do that. I've read somewhere that escort droids apparently have, since we have so many interchangeable parts, it's a lot easier for us to be able to change different colors of things. So it wouldn't be the usual maintenance that humans would need to dye their hair.
Really? I didn't think that would be something that would be so customizable for you guys.
Yeah, I can really change anything about myself, and I just love that I have all these options. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Captain.
Of course, Aiko. I'm more than happy to be of assistance to you anytime.
Oh, come here, you, and then...
She gives him a kiss on the cheek. He's like, Aiko, all right, we got to focus on the mission. Come on. It wouldn't be that. It's occasional chatter, not that much. But like something like that, just that little, like, I don't know. Be honest, Aiko. Do you think I'll be able to get my eyesight back?
Well, I don't know. But if you get cyborg prosthetics in any way like Cinder has hers, then at least you'll be better off for it.
What do you mean? I mean, X-ray vision would be cool, but I feel like you're referring to something more.
Well, Cinder has all these different abilities that she can do because of her cyborg prosthetics. I don't know if yours will be anything similar to that, but there's nothing wrong with having some metal in you. I mean, all things considered.
Yeah, I suppose that you're pretty right.
Guys, quiet down. We're making our descent.
Oh, sorry, Cinder.
Sorry.
Like that. I don't know. Just mindless chatter. I love this book. Cinder spent the ride switching between news feeds covering the royal wedding and the ongoing coverage of the rebellion in Farafra. The townspeople had given up their control of the military personnel as soon as reinforcements arrived. Rather than attempt to arrest and transport hundreds of civilians, the Commonwealth military, with permission from the African government, put the entire city into armed lockdown until they could all be thoroughly questioned and charged. The citizens were being treated as traitors to the Earthen Union for helping Lynn Cinder, Dimitri Erland, and Carswell Thorne, although the news kept reporting that the government was willing to be lenient with anyone who came forward with information about the fugitives, their allies, and their ship. So far, not one of the citizens of Farafra seems to be cooperating. Good! Cinder wondered if the lunar townspeople were being treated the same as the Earthens, or if they were just waiting to be sent back to Luna for their real trial. To date, no journalists had mentioned that many of the rebels were lunar. Cinder suspected the government was trying to keep that little fact quiet, to avoid mass panic in neighboring towns, or even all over the world. Which would surely come once Earthens realized how easy it was for Lunars to blend in with them. Cinder could still remember when she'd believed there weren't any Lunars on Earth, and how horrified she'd been when Dr. Erland told her she was wrong. Her reaction seemed ridiculously naive now. As New Beijing came into view, Cinder sent the news feeds away. The buildings at the city center were grand and imposing, like willowy sculptures of chrome and glass reaching toward the sky. Cinder was caught off guard by the sudden ache that hit her. Homesickness. A homesickness she'd been too busy to recognize until that moment. The palace stood regally beneath the morning sun. High on its watchful cliff, but they veered away from it. Jason followed Cinder's directions toward downtown, eventually mixing in with clusters of hovers and, she was glad to see, multiple pod ships as well. Cinder's stop was first, 2 blocks away from the Phoenix Tower apartments. Oh, please tell me she's going to go in and deck Audrey. She took in a deep breath as she disembarked. Though autumn would be sweeping in fast over the next few weeks, New Beijing was still in summer's grip, and the day was starting off cloudless and warm. The temperature was just a click above comfortable, but not stifling with humidity as it had been the last time Cinder was in the city. "If you don't see me at the checkpoint in 10 minutes," she said, "loop the block a few times and come back." Jason nodded without looking at her. "If you get the chance," said Aiko, "give Audrey a big kick in the rump for me, with the metal foot." "That's right, Aiko! I love ya!" Woo! Cinder laughed, though the sound was awkward. Then they were gone, leaving her alone on a street she'd walked 1,000 times. She'd already called up her glamour, but it was difficult to focus, so she kept her head down anyway as she made her way to the apartments she had once called home. It was strange to be alone, after weeks of being surrounded by friends and allies, but she was glad that no one else was joining her for this stage of the plan. It seemed weirdly important to distance herself from the girl she'd been when she lived in this apartment, and the idea of her new friends meeting her ex-stepfamily made her cringe. I get that. Her shirt was already sticking to her back as she approached the apartment's main entrance. She waited until another resident came through, unlocking the doors with their embedded ID chip, and slipped in behind them. A familiar dread settled over as she crossed the small lobby, a feeling that had once seemed normal. But this time she also felt a sense of purpose as she entered the elevator. She was no longer the unwanted cyborg orphan who did as she was told and skittered off to her basement workroom to avoid Audrey's bitter glares. She was free. She was in control. She didn't belong to Audrey anymore. For perhaps the first time, she stepped out of the elevator with her head high. The hallway was empty except for a mangy gray cat cleaning himself. Cinder came to apartment 1820, squared her shoulders, and knocked. Footsteps padded on the other side of the door, and she focused on her glamour. Cinder had chosen to take on the appearance of one of the officials she'd seen standing behind Kai at the last press conference. Middle-aged, slightly pudgy, with the gray flecked black hair and a too-small-for-her-face nose. She mimicked her exactly, down to the blue-gray business suit and sensible tan shoes. The door opened and a cloud of stale, hot air swept into the hallway. Audrey stood before her, tying the belt around her silk bathrobe. She almost always wore her bathrobe when she was at home, but this was not the same one Cinder was familiar with. Her hair was pulled back, and she wasn't yet wearing any makeup. There was a fine sheen of sweat on her face. Cinder expected her body to recoil under her stepmother's inspection, but it didn't. Rather, as she looked at Audrey, she felt only a detached coldness. This was just a woman with an invitation to the royal wedding. This was just another task to cross off the list. "Yes?" said Audrey, skeptical gaze swooping over her. Cinder, the palace official, bowed. "Good morning. Is Lynn Audrey G at home?" "I am Lynn Audrey." "A pleasure. I apologize for disturbing you at such an early hour," said Cinder, launching into her practice speech. "I am a member of the Royal Wedding Planning Committee, and I understand you were promised 2 invitations to the nuptials between His Imperial Majesty Emperor Cato and Her Lunar Majesty Queen Lavana. As you are one of our distinguished civilian guests, I am honored to personally deliver your invitations to tonight's ceremony." She held out 2 pieces of paper, in reality disposable napkin scraps, but to Audrey's eye, 2 finely crafted hand-pressed paper envelopes. At least she hoped that's what Audrey was seeing. The closest Cinder had come to changing the perception of an inanimate object was her own prosthetic hand, and she wasn't sure if that counted. Audrey frowned at the napkins, but it was quickly turned into a patient smile. No doubt because she now believed she was talking to someone from the palace. "There must be some mistake," she said. "We've received our invitations last week." Cinder feigned surprise and withdrew the napkins. "How peculiar! Would you mind if I took a look at those invitations, so I can make sure some mishap hasn't occurred?" Audrey's grip tightened, but she stepped aside and ushered Cinder into the apartment. "Of course. Please come in. Can I offer you some tea?" "Tea? No." "Thank you, no. We'll just clear up this confusion, and I won't intrude any more on your time." She followed Audrey into the living room. "I must apologize for the heat," said Audrey, grabbing a fan off the small side table and flicking it before her face. "The air has been broken for a week now, and the maintenance here is completely incompetent. I used to have a servant to assist with these things, a cyborg ward my husband took in, but, well, it doesn't matter now. Good riddance." Cinder bristled. Servant? But she ignored the comment as her gaze traveled over the room. It hadn't changed much, with the exception of the items displayed on the mantel of the holographic fireplace. Belongings that had held such prominent position before. Lynn Garen's award plaques and alternating digital photos of Pearl and Peony had been crammed together at the mantel's edge. Now, at its center, stood a beautiful porcelain jar, painted with pink and white peonies, and set atop a carved mahogany base. Cinder sucked in a breath. Not a jar, an urn. A cremation urn. Her mouth went dry. She heard Audrey padding across the living room, but her focus was pinned to that urn. And who would be inside it? Of their own accord, her feet began to move toward the mantel and Peony's remains. Her funeral had come and gone, and Cinder had not been there. Audrey and Pearl had wept, had no doubt invited every person from Peony's classes, every person from this apartment building, every distant relative who had barely known her, who had probably griped about having to send the expected sympathy card and flowers. But Cinder hadn't been there. "My daughter," said Audrey. Cinder gasped and pulled away. She hadn't realized that her fingers were brushing against a painted flower until Audrey had spoken. "Gone recently, only recently, of Letumosis," Audrey continued, as if Cinder had asked. "She was only 14. There was a sadness in her voice, true sadness. It was perhaps the one thing they had ever had in common. "I'm sorry," Cinder whispered, grateful that in her distraction some instinct had maintained her glamour. She forced herself to focus before her eyes started trying to make tears. They would fail. She was incapable of crying, but the effort sometimes gave her a headache that wouldn't go away for hours, and now was not the time for mourning. She had a wedding to stop. "Do you have any children?" Audrey asked. No, I don't," said Cinder, having no idea if the palace official she was impersonating did or not. "I have one other daughter, 17 years old. It was not very long ago that all I could think of was finding her a nice, wealthy husband. Daughters are expensive, you know, and a mother wants to give them everything. But now, I can't stand the thought of her leaving me too." She sighed and tore her gaze away from the urn. "But listen to me carrying on when you must have so many other places to be today. Here are the invitations we received." Cinder took them carefully, glad to change the subject. Now she was seeing a real invitation up close. She changed the glamour she'd made up for the napkins. The paper was a little stiffer, slightly more ivory, with gold embossed letters in a flourishing script on one side and traditional second-era kanji on the other. "Interesting," said Cinder, opening the top invitation. She faked a laugh, hoping it didn't sound as painful as it was. These are the invitations for Lin Zhong and his wife. Your addresses must have gotten switched in our database. How silly." Audrey cocked her head. "Are you sure? When they arrived, I was certain—" "See for yourself." Cinder angled the paper so Audrey could see what wasn't there. What Cinder told her to see. What Cinder told her to believe. "Goodness, so it is," said Audrey. Cinder handed Audrey the napkins and watched as her stepmother handled them as though they were the most precious items in the world. "Well then," she said, her voice barely warbling, "I'll see myself out. I hope you'll enjoy the ceremony." Audrey dropped the napkins into her robe's pocket. "Thank you for taking the time to deliver these yourself. His Imperial Majesty certainly is a gracious host." "We are lucky to have him," Cinder meandered into the hallway. As her hand landed on the door, she realized with a jolt that this could be the last time she ever saw her stepmother. The very last time, if she dared to hope. She attempted to smother the temptation that rolled inside her at the thought, but she still found herself turning back to face Audrey. "I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say to you." But all the common sense in the world could not convince her of those words. "I don't mean to pry," she started again, clearing her throat. "But you mentioned a cyborg before. You wouldn't happen to be the guardian of Lin Cinder?" Audrey's kindness fell away. "I was, unfortunately. Thank the stars that's all behind us now." Against all her reasoning, Cinder stepped back into the apartment, blocking the doorway. "But she grew up here. Didn't you ever feel that she could be a part of your family? Didn't you ever think of her as a daughter? Audrey huffed, fanning herself again. You didn't know the girl. Always ungrateful, always thinking she was so much better than us because of her additions. Cyborgs are like that, you know. So self-important. It was awful for us living with her. A cyborg and a Luna, although we didn't know it until her mortifying spectacle at the ball. She tightened her belt. And now she's soiled our family name. I have to ask that you not judge us by her. I did all I could to help the girl, but she was unredeemable from the start. Cinder's fingers twitched, a familiar taste of rebellion. She ached to toss off her glamour, to yell and scream, to force Audrey to see her, the real her, just once. Not the ungrateful, self-important little girl that Audrey thought she was, but the orphan who had always just wanted a family, who had only wanted to belong somewhere. But even as she thought this, a darker yearning climbed up her spine. She wanted Audrey to be sorry for how she treated Cinder like a piece of property, for how she had taken Cinder's prosthetic foot and forced her to hobble around like a broken doll, for how she had taunted Cinder again and again for her inability to cry, her inability to love, inability to ever be human. She found herself reaching out with her mind, detecting the waves of bioelectricity that shimmered off the surface of Audrey's skin. Before she could rein in the anger that rolled through her, Cinder pressed every ounce of guilt and remorse and shame into her stepmother's thick skull, twisting her emotions so rashly that Audrey gasped and stumbled, her sides slamming into the wall. But didn't you ever wonder how hard it must have been? Cinder said through her teeth. A headache was coming on fast, throbbing against her dry eyes. Didn't you ever feel guilty the way she was treated? Didn't you ever think that maybe you could have loved her if only you'd taken the time to talk to her, to understand her? Audrey groaned and pressed one hand to her stomach, like the years of guilt had been eating away at her, slowly making her sick. Cinder grimaced and began to ease up on the attack of emotions when Audrey met her gaze again. There were tears watering her eyes. Her breath was ragged. Sometimes, Audrey said, her tone weak, sometimes I do think that maybe she was misunderstood. She was so young when we adopted her. She must have been afraid. And my darling Peony always seemed so fond of her, and sometimes I think if things had been different with Garen and our finances, perhaps she could have belonged here. You understand, if only she had been normal. The last word struck Cinder between her ribs, and she flinched, releasing the small strands of guilt. Audrey shuddered, swiping her robe sleeve across her eyes. It made no difference. Audrey could be filled with all the guilt in the world, but in her own mind, the blame would always be with Cinder. Because Cinder couldn't have just been normal. I'm so sorry, said Audrey, pinching the bridge of her nose. She'd gone pale, the tears were gone. I don't know what came over me. Ever since I lost my daughter, sometimes my mind just... She turned her focus back up to Cinder. Please don't misunderstand me. Lynn Cinder, she's a lying, manipulative girl. I hope they catch her. I would do anything to make sure she can't ruin anyone else the way she ruined me and my family. Cinder nodded. I understand, Linji. I completely understand. Curling her fingers around the invitation she came for, Cinder ducked back out of the apartment. The headache was splitting against her skull now, making it hard to focus on anything other than putting each foot in front of the other. She managed to maintain a flimsy grip on the glamour, not sure if Audrey was still watching her, until she stepped into the elevator at the end of the corridor. She froze. On the back wall of the elevator was a mirror. She stared back at her own reflection as the doors slipped shut behind her. Her heart started to pound. Thankfully no one else was in the elevator to witness her, because she lost her hold on the glamour immediately, gaping into her own brown eyes, and, for the first time, felt horrified of who she saw in the reflection. Because what she'd done to Audrey, twisting her emotions against her, forcing her to feel guilt and shame for no other reason than Cinder's own terrible curiosity, her own burning desire for retaliation. It was something Lavana would have done.
This little tea.
She has a point. And she should be disgusted because, like she says, it's exactly what Lavana would have done. Take revenge. Cause someone to suffer for the sake of suffering. Cause someone to suffer because that's what you want. That's what you need. She did what Lavana would have done. She did what any lunar royal thaumaturge or otherwise would have done. Do I blame her? No. She wanted Audrey to be sorry because she wanted... Cinder wanted to feel loved. She wanted Audrey to feel remorse and to say, I feel so bad for what had happened. I miss her. I never realized that how much I truly loved her. But in Audrey's mind, it's always Cinder's fault. I don't know. 45. Aiko blew kisses and waved, a fluttery five-fingered wave, as the pot ship coasted off the road and merged with the morning traffic. It was not a far walk to the warehouse, but she could feel her internal processor humming with excitement the whole way. By her calculation, they would be arriving at the warehouse by 7:25 a.m. The delivery hover filled with the palace's order of 60 escorts was set to depart from the warehouse at 7:32. Half of the escorts would be dropped off at the catering office by 7:58. The rest would be delivered to the florist at 8:43, to be taken to the palace along with the human staff. Aiko expected that she would be inside the palace by no later than 9:50. The industrial district was mostly deserted. Much of the city, and perhaps the whole world, had taken this as a holiday in order to watch the royal wedding. No one was around to notice Aiko as she strutted down the alley toward the warehouse or hopped blithely over the chain-link fence into the yard where 5 delivery ships were backed up to the warehouse loading docks. She was dressed simply in black slacks and a white blouse. She was a little disappointed when she couldn't wear a fancy ball gown, but she felt stunning in her own way. She couldn't wait for Emperor Kai to see her. The thought put an extra bounce in her step as she rounded the front of the first ship and darted up the stairs into the loading dock. The sight before her made her pause and almost crash face first onto her perfectly shaped nose. The warehouse was filled with escort droids, mostly girls, of all different skin tones and hair colors. Most were unclothed, sitting on the ground with their arms wrapped compactly around their knees and their heads tucked down. There were well over 200 androids lined up in neat rows. Some had packing tape and protective tissue wrapped around their limbs to protect them during shipping. Some had been loaded onto pallets and settled onto plastic crates. Packing foam and cardboard littered the floor around them. It's got to be kind of fucked up being an escort droid, or as she is now, and then seeing like, oh, this is what I am. Property. But, I mean, Aiko wears it beautifully, so... On the wall to Aiko's left, there were 3 stories of metal shelving filled with the packing crates, all labeled with the escort's makes and models and special features. "Is this all of them?" said a man. Aiko ducked behind the wall of the warehouse before inching forward and peering around the door jamb. She spotted 60 androids, 45 female and 15 male, all standing in neat rows. They were all dressed in identical black pants and blush-toned silk tops. Simple mandarin-collared dress shirts for the men, and elegant wraps for the women that tied at the waists in draped kimono style on their arms. Each girl had her hair pulled back into a tight bun with an orchid tucked into the side. "Checking off the order now," said a woman who was marching between the rows and making notations on a port screen. "The order form specified a petite model of make 618, not the medium." I know, but our last petite got shipped out last week. I cleared the change with the palace on Thursday." That was too Thorn. Let me give him a dumb voice. "I know, but our last petite got shipped out last week. I cleared the change with the palace on Thursday." The woman tapped something into the port. 4960. That's all of them. "Great. Let's load them up. Can't let them be late for their royal mission." The man pulled up the massive rolling door, opening the bay to one of the delivery ships, as the woman began making her way through the androids again, opening a panel in each of their necks. Their postures stiffened. "Enter, single file," ordered the man. "Squeeze in tight, it'll be a close fit." The androids marched one by one into the ship. There was no way Aiko could get all the way over there without being noticed, and her different clothes would make it clear that she didn't belong. The idea that they could mistake her for a rogue android and send her out for reprogramming made her wiring quiver. Keeping low... Keeping low, she slinked along the wall, away from the 2 employees, and ducked beneath the first tower of industrial shelving. Hidden behind the crates, she made her way toward the row of escort droids that were waiting to be packaged up. Reaching the last row, she crouched down behind an android and felt for the latch on her neck. Aiko glanced up to see that half of the rental escort droids had already settled into the ship. Humming to herself, she turned the android on. The processor whirred and her head raised. This one had white blonde hair tipped with fluorescent green that hung to her waist. Aiko brushed her hair off her shoulder and whispered,
I command you to stand up, scream, and run for the exit.
The girl launched to her feet almost before Aiko finished speaking. She started to scream, a spine-chilling, ear-bleeding sound. Okay. Oh, hold up. So I want to enact that. So Aiko says to stand up, scream, and go to the exit. Ah! Yeah, something to that effect. Oh, dear. Hand movements and everything. Aiko threw herself to the ground behind the row of still seated and oblivious androids and adjusted the volume on her audio processor, but it was too late. The android had already stopped screaming and was now running full speed for the exit, knocking her statue-like brethren over as she passed. Aiko heard the two employees' cries of shock, and then her footsteps pounding as they chased after the android. As soon as they jumped down into the loading yard, Aiko bounced up and scurried through the rows of androids. The rental escorts said nothing, only blinked at her lazily as she pushed her way into their midst.
Sorry, don't mind me coming through. Oh, what? Hello there.
To a particularly handsome Kai look-alike droid, which had no more reaction than any of the others.
Or not, she muttered, brushing past them. Pardon me, a little space, please. Thank you. Oh, there we go. Excuse me, by the way.
She didn't say those last bits, I just threw that in. By the time the two workers had returned, winded and ranting about faulty personality chips and those imbeciles up in programming, Aiko had settled comfortably in the back of the ship, squeezed between two of her distant cousins and finding it difficult not to grin like a lunatic. As it turned out, being human was every bit as fun as she'd always thought it would be. You go, girl! And then there's a break. It was easy to grasp why the government of 126 years ago... Hold up, there's a thing here. There we go. It was easy to grasp why the government of 126 years ago had chosen this spot for the royal family's safe house. It was less than 10 miles from the city of New Beijing, but they were separated by such jagged cliffs that it seemed as though they had entered another country entirely. The house itself was built in a valley carved out of overgrown rice terraces, though Cinder doubted any rice had been cultivated there in generations, giving the house a sense of abandonment. Jason settled the pod ship beside the farmhouse, and they stepped out onto a patch of land, still soggy from the summer rains. The world was silent around them, and the air perfumed with fall grasses and wildflowers. I hope the girl was right, said Jason, moving toward the house. Despite its boarded-up windows, it appeared well-maintained. Cinder suspected that a crew was responsible for checking on it a couple of times a year, to patch roof tiles and ensure that the power generator wasn't malfunctioning, so that if a catastrophe ever did occur, it would still be a safe place for the Emperor to retire to. It was probably monitored too, but she hoped that today of all days the country's security team would have their hands full elsewhere. One way to find out, she said, walking around to the side of the house, where iron doors rested over a cellar entryway. If Cress was right... If Cress was right, these doors didn't lead to a dank storage cellar at all, but to a tunnel that would run beneath the cliffs and lead them straight to the palace sublevels. Cinder pried open the doors and whipped her built-in flashlight around the stairs. The light caught on cobwebs and concrete and an old-fashioned switch that would light up the tunnel beneath, at least for a little distance. This seems to be it, she said, glancing back at the group. Thorn, blindfolded, was resting his elbow on a scowling Dr. Erland. It was going to be a long walk. All right, she said. Jason, come back with the Rampion and circle the city until you get my comm. I know. And keep an eye out for anything suspicious. If you detect anything at all, keep flying and wait for us to contact you again. I know. If everything goes as planned, we'll be at the palace landing pad by 1800, but if something goes wrong, we might have to come back here. Or through one of the escape tunnels to the other safe... Cinder! Said Thorn. He knows. She glared at him and wanted to argue, but going over their escape plan one more time wasn't going to do anything but remind her of all the things that could go wrong. Jason did know. They discussed the matter into the ground, and everyone was all too aware of how easily this plan could fall apart without him, without any of them. Fine. Let's go. Chapter 46. Here we are. It's happening. Cress studied herself in the full-length dressing room mirror and began to cry. Almost began to cry. She had somehow, someway, become a character in an opera. Her skin had sloughed off the last of the sunburn, leaving the tiniest kiss of sun on her complexion. Aiko had cropped her hair so that it framed her face in pretty golden waves, and though they'd had no makeup aboard the ship, Aiko had also taught her to pinch her cheeks and nibble on her lips until they flushed a nice pinkish color. Yeah. I'm getting all tongue-tied. Need a little tea. It's a little tea. A little tea. A little tea.
A little tea.
She was, against her better judgment, beginning to warm to Aiko. At least she wasn't as bad as Darla had been. And though Cress herself had been the one to place the rush purchase at the designer boutique, using a hacked financial account, she hadn't entirely believed all this was happening before this moment. She was going to a royal wedding, in a gown of raw silk and chiffon, dyed deep royal blue to match her eyes. Aiko's suggestion. The bodice was snug, and the skirt was so full she wasn't entirely sure she could walk without tripping. The shoes were simple form-fitting flats. Though she and Aiko had discussed an array of fancy heels at length, Cinder had reminded them Cinder had reminded them that Cress may have to run for her life at some point during the day's events, and practically had won out. And practicality had won out. Bristol May, what do you think? Asked the attendant as she finished with the last button on Cress's back.
It's perfect, thank you, the girl preened. We are thrilled that you chose us for your royal wedding debut. We could not have been more honored. She scooped Cress's hair away from her ears. Do you have your jewelry with you to see how it all looks together? How it all looks put together? Yeah.
Cress tugged awkwardly at her earlobe.
Oh, no, that's all right. I have to pick it up on the way to the palace.
Though a flicker of confusion crossed the girl's face, she merely bowed her head and shuffled out of the dressing room.
Are you ready for your husband to see you?
She flinched.
I suppose.
She followed the attendant out of the dressing room and into a luxuriously furnished sitting area where she spotted her new husband. Wolf was scowling at a mirror and trying to pat down his unkempt hair. He wore an impeccably fitted tuxedo with a classic white bow tie and pressed lapels. He caught Cress's eye in the reflection, and she couldn't help but stand a little straighter. But though his gaze skimmed over her, he had no reaction whatsoever. Deflated, Cress clasped her hands.
You look great, sweetheart.
He did, in fact, look like a romance hero, all muscles and edges and chiseled bone structure. He also looked miserable. Suddenly nervous, Cress gave a little twirl, displaying her full regalia. Wolf only gave her a crisp nod. The hover is waiting. She let her hands drop to her sides, resigned to the fact that Wolf would dress for his role, but he would not play it.
Right. You have the invitations?
He patted his breast pocket. Let's get this over with. In the delivery ship, traveling... Oh, there's a break there, and then... In the delivery ship, traveling from the warehouse to the caterer, Aiko had found it all too easy to command another android to switch clothes so that she could fit in with the rest of them in her staff uniforms. As long as no one was too put off by her blue hair braids, which had now been pulled into a neat bun. She had departed the ship with the first group of rental androids at the catering office, so that when her body double was later discovered wearing the wrong clothes at the florist's, Aiko would be long gone. And who would ever suspect her? She was just another brainless, obedient android. But that was the hard part. Standing in perfect unison with the others, blinking precisely 10 times a minute, keeping quiet while the human catering staff chatted excitedly about maybe seeing the Emperor himself, and ruminated over how terrifying it would be if Queen Levana wasn't pleased with the food. Aiko was forced to bite her tongue, allowing her programmed instincts, the instincts she'd spent her life trying to keep buried while she learned about humor and sarcasm and affection, to keep her expressionless. From there, they had been herded into a large hover. Though it wasn't a far distance, the trip was made longer as the hover rounded to the back of the palace, near the research and laboratory facilities, and, of course, the staff entrance. Aiko sensed the chatter of the catering staff grow more nervous as the hover began to slow. She heard some gates being opened, and then the hover came to a gradual stop, and the staff began to file into a commercial loading dock. It was not the fancy entryway that Aiko had always envisioned entering the palace, but she tried not to let her disappointment show as she fell into line behind her stiff cohorts. 2 women were standing by the delivery entrance. One wearing a jewel-toned sari was notating something on her port screen, while the other scanned ID chips, ensuring that the staff had been pre-approved to work at this crucial event. When she'd finished with the humans, she ordered the escort droids into 2 single-file lines. Aiko slipped into the back as they were ushered inside. They were marched through to the drab service halls, their shoes clicking in perfect synchronization. Aiko kept careful track of their progress, counting doors and comparing it with the blueprint that had been downloaded to her memory. The kitchen was precisely where she expected it, and even more massive in person than it appeared on screen. With 8 industrial-sized ovens, countless burners, and 3 counters that ran the length of the room where dozens of chefs were chopping, kneading, whisking, and measuring as they prepared to feed 1,200 of the galaxy's most honored guests. The woman in the sari pulled a man in the chef's coat aside. "The androids!" she yelled over the din, gesturing to Aiko and the others. "Where do you want them?" He scanned the line, his attention briefly snagging on Aiko's blue hair. Evidently, he determined that it wasn't in his job description to care, and he let his gaze slide past her. "Leave them here for now. We'll send them out with the regular staff during the first course. All they have to do is carry a tray and smile. Think they can handle that?" Yeah, he's a chef for sure. "We've been assured that their programming is immaculate. It would be best if they could focus on our lunar guests. I want them alert in case anything untoward happens." He shrugged. "No one on my staff wants anything to do with the Lunars." The man returned to his work, organizing gold trays at different workstations, and the woman left without another look at the androids. Aiko stood very, very still, and she was very, very well behaved. And she waited, and waited, and tried to imagine what was happening with Cinder and Cress and the others. None of the kitchen staff paid them any attention other than to shoot them the occasional glare for taking up too much space in the overcrowded kitchens. Aiko waited until she was confident no one was looking at her, before she inched her hand behind the escort droid behind her. The android didn't even twitch as Aiko sought out the latch in her neck, opened it, and ran her fingers over the control panel. She pushed up a switch. "Now accepting input commands," said the android in a voice that was not quite human, not quite robot. Hope I did that right. Aiko dropped her hand to her side and scanned the nearby chefs. The kitchen was too loud. No one had heard. "Follow me!" Then, when she was again sure no one was watching, she ducked into the nearest corridor. The android followed like a trained pet. Aiko took them down 2 hallways, listening for voices or footsteps, but finding these lesser-used areas abandoned. As expected, all available staff was preparing for the ceremony and the reception, no doubt measuring the distance between plates and soup spoons at that very moment. When they reached a maintenance closet, Aiko ushered the escort droid inside. "I want you to know that I hold nothing against you," she said by way of introduction. "I understand that it isn't your fault your programmer had so little imagination." The escort droid held her gaze with empty eyes. "In another life, we could have been sisters, and I feel it's important to acknowledge that." A blank stare, a blink every 6 seconds. "But as it stands, I'm a part of an important mission right now, and I cannot be swayed from my goal by my sympathy for androids who are less advanced than myself." Nothing. "All right, then." Aiko held out her hands. "I need your clothes." Hey, at least Aiko's got her manners. Chapter 47. Cress dug her fingers into the hover seat, leaning into the window until her breath fogged against the glass. It's always time for tea. She couldn't open her eyes wide enough. Not when there was so much to see. Not when there was so much she could barely take it all in. Not when she could barely take it all in. The city of New Beijing was endless. To the east, a cluster of skyscrapers rose up out of the earth, silver and glass sparkling orange under the late afternoon sun. Beyond the city center were warehouses and areas, parks and suburbs rolling on and on. Cress was glad for the distraction of all the new sights, the buildings, the people. Otherwise, she thought she would be sick. She gasped as the palace came into view atop its cliff, recognizing it for the countless pictures and vids. Still, it was so different in real life, even more magnificent and imposing. She splayed her fingers on the window, framing it in her vision. She could make out a line of vehicles and a mass of people outside the gates, winding down the cliffside and into the city below. Wolf also had his fierce eyes focused on the approaching palace, but she could sense no amount of awe from him, only impatience. His knee wouldn't stop bouncing and his fingers kept flexing and tightening. Watching him was making her nervous. He'd been so subdued back at the Rampion, so impossibly motionless, she wondered if this burst of energy was the first sign that the bomb inside him had started to tick. Or maybe he was just anxious, like she was. Maybe he was tracing over their plan in his mind. Or maybe he was thinking about that girl, Scarlet. Cress was sad that she hadn't met her. It was as if the crew of the Rampion were missing a vital piece, and Cress didn't understand how she fit. She tried to think of the things she knew about Scarlet Benoit. She'd researched her a little when Cinder and Thorn had landed on the ship on her grandmother's farm, but not very much. At the time, she'd had no idea that Scarlet had joined them. And Cress had only spoken with her once, when the whole crew had contacted her and asked for her help. She seemed nice enough, but Cress had been so focused on Thorn she could hardly remember anything other than curly red hair. Fidgeting with the straps of her dress, she glanced at Wolf again, catching him in an attempt to loosen his bow tie.
Can I ask you a question?
His eyes swept over her. It's not about hacking security systems, is it? She blinked.
Of course not.
Then fine. She smoothed her skirt around her knees.
This Scarlet. You're in love with her, aren't you?
He froze, becoming stone still. As the hover climbed the hill to the palace, his shoulders sank, and he returned his gaze to the window. She's my alpha, he murmured with a haunting sadness in his voice. I'm sorry, Wolf. That breaks my heart. Alpha. Cress leaned forward, propping her elbows on her knees.
Like the star?
What star? She stiffened, instantly embarrassed, and scooted back from him again.
Oh, in a constellation, the brightest star is called the Alpha. I thought maybe you meant that she's like your brightest star.
Looking away, she nodded her hands in her lap, aware that she was blushing furiously now, and this beast of a man was about to realize what an over-romantic sap she was. But instead of sneering or laughing, Wolf sighed. Yes, he said, his gaze climbing up to the full moon that had emerged over the city. Exactly like that. With a quick twist to her heart, Cress's fear of him began to subside. She'd been right back at the boutique. He was like the hero of a romance story, and he was trying to rescue his beloved, his alpha. Cress had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep her imagination from skittering away with her. This wasn't some silly story. Scarlet Benoit was a prisoner on Luna. It was very likely that she was already dead. It was a thought that settled heavily in Cress's gut as the hover pulled in front of the palace gates. A greeter opened the door, and thousands of voices crowded in around them. With a shudder, Cress gave the greeter her hand as she'd seen girls do on the net dramas. Her heel hit the tiled drive, and she was suddenly surrounded. Crowds of journalists and onlookers, both peaceful and angry, flocked around the courtyard, snapping photos, calling out questions, holding up signs that urged the Emperor not to go through with this. What is it, sweetheart? My dog's getting all riled up for some reason. Cress ducked her head, wanting to crawl back into the hover and hide from the piercing lights and throbbing chatter. The world began to spin. Oh, spades. She was going to faint.
Miss? Miss, are you well?
Her throat went dry, blood rushed through her ears, and she was drowning, suffocating. Then a firm grip was on her elbow, drawing her away from the courtier. She stumbled, but Wolf put his iron-solid arm around her waist and squeezed her against him, forcing her to match his strides. Beside him, she felt as small and frail as a bird, but there was also a sense of protection. She focused on that, and within moments, a comforting dream slipped around her. She was a famous net drama actress, making a big debut, and Wolf was her bodyguard. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. She simply had to hold her head high and be brave and be graceful and be confident. Her fine ball gown became a costume. The media became her adoring fans. Her spine straightened, millimeter by trembling millimeter, as the tingling darkness began to recede from her vision. "All right," Wolf murmured. "I am a famous actress," she whispered back. She dared not look up at him, afraid it would ruin the spell her imagination had cast. After a moment, his grip loosened. The noise of the crowd behind them faded away, replaced with the calm serenity of bubbling streams and the whisper of bamboo in the palace gardens. Cress stared straight ahead at the looming entrance, flanked by crimson pergolas. 2 more courtiers waited at the top of the steps. Wolf produced the 2 embossed invitations. Cress was perfectly still as the scanner light flickered over the tiny chip that was embedded in the paper. She and Wolf wouldn't have fit the roles of Lynn Audrey and her daughter, but it had been child's play to change the ID profiles coded on each chip. According to the port screen, Wolf was now Mr. Samhain Bristol, a Parliament representative from Toronto, East Canada, Providence, UK, and she was his young wife. The actual Mr. Bristol was, to Cress's knowledge, still safe at home and unaware that he had a body double negating the political point he was trying to make by not attending the royal wedding. Cress hoped it would stay that way. She released a breath as the courtier returned the invitations to Wolf without a hint of hesitation. "We are so pleased you could join us after all, Bristol Darren," he said. "Please proceed to the ballroom where you will be escorted to your seats." By the time he finished, he was already reaching for the invitations of the couple behind him. Wolf guided her forward, and if he was sharing any of her anxiety, he didn't show it. The main corridor was lined with palace guards in fine red coats and tasseled epaulets. Cress recognized the painted screen on the wall, mountains standing over misty clouds and a crane-filled lake. Her gaze instinctively fitted up to one of the ornate chandeliers that lined the corridor, and though it was too small for her to see, she knew that one of the Queen's cameras was there, watching them now. Though she doubted the Queen or Sybil or anyone who could possibly have recognized Cress was bothering to watch the surveillance feeds at that moment, she nevertheless turned her head away and started laughing as if Wolf had made a joke. He frowned at her. "These chandeliers are extraordinary, aren't they?" she said, putting as much lightness into her tone as she could. Wolf's expression remained unfazed, and after a blank moment, he shook his head and resumed his steady pace toward the ballroom. They found themselves on a landing that swooped down a grand staircase and opened up into an enormous, beautiful room. The mere size of it reminded her of the desert's expansiveness, and she was overwhelmed by the same awe and dizziness she'd had before. She was glad they weren't the only ones lingering at the top of the stairs and watching as the crowd drifted in and filled up rows of plush seats behind them. There was at least an hour before the ceremony would officially begin, and many of the guests were using the time to mingle and take in the beauty of it all. Many pillars throughout the room were carved with gold-tinted dragons, and the walls were filled with so many bouquets of flowers, some as tall as Cress, that it was like the gardens had begun to grow wild inside. Half a dozen bird cages stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, displaying doves and mockingbirds and sparrows, which sang in a chaotic melody that rivaled the beauty of the orchestra. Cress turned to face Wolf so that, should anyone look at them, it would seem as though they were in deep conversation. He bent his head toward her to complete the masquerade, though his focus was on the nearest guard. "You don't suppose we should mingle, do you?" "Oh, sorry. You don't suppose we should mingle, do you?" He screwed up his nose. "I think we better not." Glancing around, he held his elbow toward her. "But perhaps we could go sympathize with some caged birds." Oh, my guy. My freaking guy, dude. I'm sorry, bro. He is so heartbroken right now. It's like painful. It's just absolutely painful to listen to him. But, I mean, what do you expect? Scarlett's gone, and he's a lone wolf. So the fact that he let anyone into his life, and then now she's taken away like that, and taken to literally the one place on Earth that would torture her beyond anything, any sort of like human recognition. No. I'm sorry, dude. But this is it. Everyone's in position. Thereabouts. So, Aiko is changing clothes with the android to go convince Kai to leave the party and run away with her so he can be kidnapped. Cinder is going through the tunnels with Dr. Erland and Thorn. Erland and Thorn on their way to the lab to fix Thorn's eyesight and to cause a commotion. And Cinder on her way to meet up with Aiko to kidnap Kai. Cress and Wolf have successfully entered into the party, which, very nice touch, and I thought that was going to be a thing. Well, actually, no, I didn't. I had like an inkling of a thought, but then I smothered it. That one Mr. Bristol, the UK, Eastern Canada, whatever dignitary that decided not to show as a political point. I thought for a moment and then didn't because I thought, no, that's not what it is. And I was wrong. That would be used as their way to get into the ball. Or excuse me, the wedding. Brilliant work on Cress's part. For frickin' sure on that. Wolf is lucky in his role in that he doesn't have to do anything major, talking-wise. But I feel like someone's going to press him on that because of how many people are at that wedding. Someone's going to recognize him. Maybe not recognize him, but ask him who he is, and then they're going to have to go with their thing, and then they're going to ask him stuff that only the real Bristol knows. So that's totally going to be a thing. But shy of that, everything is going surprisingly smoothly. Like, I thought there would be some like last-minute changes or, oh, this didn't work. I mean, Aiko had a bit of that with trying to sneak onto the hover that had all the escort droids. So that was cool, having her sneak around and do that. But aside from that, Wolf and Cress are having their part of the plan go smoothly. Cinder and Erland and Thorn are having their part of the plan go smoothly. Except for, Cinder deciding, oh, I want to make Audrey suffer, which, hey, I get it. Audrey sucks. But the pieces are all lined up. Everything is all set, and I feel like in the next chapter, yeah. So the next chapter has Cress or Cinder getting ready. Cinder is getting ready in the tunnels, so I'm curious to see like what's going to happen there with their setup. But their setup is basically done. They just need to get to the designated points, and then Erland and Thorn trip the alarm. I wonder if they're going to trip the alarm before, during, or after Thorn gets his eyesight back. I don't know. And then Erland is being a real sport by going along for this, because, like, given his age, you would think that he would want to chill back, but no, he's being pretty good about it, and he's taking direction very well. It's probably bugging him, like, why do I have to babysit the blind kid? But no, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good for all the pieces are, and I'm excited to see where it's going to go. Very excited to see where it's all going to go. But for now, it's time for us to say goodbye. It's time for us to give thanks for you guys watching, listening, wherever you are out there, as I have another sip of tea. Thank you guys for watching, and in the next bit, the royal wedding is here. Let's blow it up.